This presentation is part of a broader research on strategies for urban regeneration through culture by cultural and creative clusters. One of the titled explored concepts in urban planning that has challenged us is the concept of critical mass. It is a corollary of more complex mechanisms around the globalization and metropolization process. For that matter, cultural clusters are considered in actual urban systems to be means of which cities become metropolises and accelerate urban development. Therefore, the presence of resources and actors' critical mass is the main condition for initiating cultural clustering. Indeed, the critical mass is the threshold to be reached of the city, beyond which it would improve its competitiveness and attractiveness. Once this is achieved, positive externalities make it possible to establish sustainable development in urban and cultural projects. But what interactions and parameters can exist between the cultural cluster and the city? We will firstly try to understand key concepts, the main of this in the main the main concepts in this research to contribute to the comprehension of the concept of critical mass and its leverage effect in urban strategies and cultural clusters development. Then, secondly, we propose to study three cases of cultural clusters which present different contexts and approaches. These examples provide us with information on clustering process, on models of clusters organization which have favored act in the development of their context and cities. The examples are analyzed on the basis of official monographs, urban planning instruments, legal text, and city mapping. This allows shedding light on the state of the coherence between local urban planning, cultural policy, undertaking actions, and recommendations for improving all the situations. Thirdly, in order to go through this step, this research aim is about a generic benchmark method to allows us to a comparative analysis of clustering models in three cities, Florence, Istanbul, and Fez. It results in a grid of key success factors as a reference cross-referring with clustering challenges of each example for urban strategy generalization. The objective of this key SF grid that we can see later is to identify the strategic issues allowing the development of cultural clustering integrated in the metropolization process. First of all, cultural clusters provide a large corpus of knowledge woven by economists, geographers, and urban planners based on the notion of relations environment, social networks, creativity, identity, territorial linking, synergy, and geographical proximity. They are defined as critical mass in one place of unusual competitive success in particular fields. What is the critical mass? Also known as critical size, this concept is used in several scientific disciplines, and it is the threshold that a territory seeks to reach and which constitutes a level beyond which it will be able to improve its competitiveness and attractiveness. At this critical size, positive externalities and local resources allows the territory in question to establish development projects, production and reduction cost, and improvement in urban quality. That critical mass in urban areas is composed with several components as shown as this scheme. It is complex and related to local resources, to a system of actors and networks to different proximities, generating all a dynamic process of collective learning. Thereby, it is a transcription in a geographical circumscribed perimeter of optimal actors, size, resources, and stroke interaction between them. That phenomenon of reaching an optimal size is also based on the interaction between the centripetal forces and the city that the city offers, and conversely the positive qualitative changes that cluster generates for the city and its attractiveness. For territories that are not attractive enough, the issue is image marketing strategy and event for a crucial feedback for actors' critical mass favorable to a clustering. These characteristics bring us back to question of relevant scale of the study cluster within clearly delimited perimeter of local action. Obviously, the larger scale is occurred for planning according to triggering a cluster considered as a critical mass of amenities and resources necessary for that process. The challenges of urban actors is to know how to find a balance between the reach of optimal critical size and a meticulous knowledge of the territory. This is how we show the balance between all the parameters in an ecosystem. And they are flourishing since they have become a leitmotif for local development actors, providing they have required critical mass. Thus, these systems are considered an innovative environment according to the Grammy research as a multi-dimensional in nature, promoting innovation network through the interaction of three dimensions. The urban organization dimension, the cognitive dimension, and the organizational dimension. To understand how the different factors and components interact with the defining perimeter, three clusters are analyzed. This horizontal comparison by generic benchmark is about the fact that contexts studied do not necessarily have the same social and economical and urban characteristics, but the strategies adopted inform us for a possible approaches, scales, and components that can be used in inspiration for possible urban projects in that direction and in other contexts. The examples, while different, are selected according to that common criteria. First example is the cultural cluster of Florence in Italy. That city has developed a far-reaching system of symbolic scenography in architecture and urban planning. Its cluster integrates and compresses particularly all the public monuments in the city center with a very strong network. The monuments are brought together in a complete historical panorama where almost all of them have been a subject of researches in history and architecture monography. That cluster project started in 1999 between the region of Tuscany and the municipality of Florence. It was the first validated form. Then in 2002, the cluster was constituted with a considerable critical mass. Therefore, it is a consolidated cluster at the high level of its development. However, the challenge is to improve the international visibility of the cluster and to promote the know-how of the local actors in management of cultural heritage and restoration. For this, stakeholders of Florence relied heavily on cooperation with university and political actors to present experience and competitive advantage of this cluster at the level of European Commission. That to be competitive with other European cities as Barcelona. This scheme presents the three dimensions of the development of the strategy: the governance, the development, the organization, and all the outcomes. Second example is in Istanbul with the of Golden Horn Cultural Cluster. Istanbul is a megapolis and a dynamic cultural capital whose tourism is a major pillar of its urban policy. Its historic peninsula, like shown in the photos, concretes high densities of population, employment, and trade. As such, the historic center was placed on the heart of the public interventions as early as the 18th, which several development operations were carried out, particularly all through the Golden Horn, where industrial and naval activity disappeared, releasing large wastelands and numerous buildings. They participate fully in the gradual establishment of private museums cluster in the on the local authorities are seeking to frame and control. From the installation of private museums arise very dynamic and complex social and spatial decomposition. These are manifested through phenomena such as gentrification of neighborhoods that raise controversy. However, in our view, this general situation shows two aspects. First, there is a clientelic policy in favor of patrons which exclude local population in the decision-making process. Second, all through private investments and gentrification are profoundly transforming landscape. The cultural cluster remains at that embryonic stage and still not administered by metropolitan authorities. That is shown in that shimi, which a governance is not complete, but the organization and outcome is still uh, accelerating, even that the cluster is staying in embryonic stage. Third example is located on the Medina of Fez, and its cultural cluster is very dynamic. Fez is considered as the spiritual, intellectual, and cultural capital of Morocco, where an atmosphere of mysticism in the Medina seems mysterious and incomprehensible, escaping all functional rationality. The tourist policy of Fez is based on two assets. It has one of the oldest universities in the Islamic world, and it is the largest Medina in Morocco and in Maghreb. Several projects for the Medina safeguarding and settlement of craftsmanship have been encouraged and programmed with the help of international donors such as UNESCO or World Bank. The aim is to make the Medina of Fez as a showcase and as a pilot project to learn from the links that can exist between economic and social development and the perspective of architectural and urban heritage improvement. This historic center has become residential and economically alive, even if it is still confronted with social problems and the management of its heritage heavily invested by tourists beside exogenous gentrification, and acquisition of houses in the Medina and the transformation of it into Riyadh. It is a particularity of it is a particular phenomenon in this Medina which leads to it being considered as an affected global city with cosmopolitanism and other dynamics. However, from the current situation, two effects appears. First, the purely architectural approach is not accompanied by real social improvement in the Medina. The second is about the absence of social networks between craft hand guides, actors, and tourists that shown in the context, and it shows the lack of the synergy. So, holistic strategy is lacking. That what shows the shimmy. Next, around all the actors, especially UNESCO and World Bank, it's the organization of the cluster and the outcomes. The cultural cluster of Florence, through it is well ahead in the management of the development of cultural heritage in Europe, remains an optimal model of integrated management and good governance. It refers to the concept of resilience beyond its definition of the capacity to adapt and maintain its functions and development by all actors. Nevertheless, the cultural cluster of Istanbul does not conciliate cultural influence and social equity. This is beyond the very competitive position of Istanbul on a global scale in terms of cultural tourism, which the cluster contribute favorably. The cluster is only considered as an urban acupuncture in the heart of historic peninsula. As for the cluster of Fez Medina, the cultural cluster and the local planning practice and the management of cultural assets are being accelerated by both public and private actors. Also, financial aid, international expertise, as well as strong cooperations are important factors to the success of the strategy. The overview shows a panoply of several factors in four dimensions as shown as that photo. They have been identified and which constitute the different aspects of cultural clustering. We have therefore identified nine key success factors and references for regeneration strategy by cultural cluster. These factors will serve for other case studies analysis. It has been revealed beyond all the different critical masses of each cluster example that the different proximities, the synergy, and the good participatory governance with all the stakeholders remain the keystone of a success strategy. Finally, three main facts arise. All through the cultural cluster is defined as a strategy. The clustering process varies and are different from a city to another. It depends on the primary endowment and critical masses of each city. Secondly, all through the presence of critical mass of resources, it as a sine qua non condition to clustering, other parameters are also necessary, such as a presence of strong networks, proximity, and synergy between all the stakeholders. Thirdly, cultural clustering, which is part of a local scale, draws its strengthening from a larger scale, which is the metropolises scale. Services and infrastructures offered by the metropolis are centripetal forces that serve to motor the cultural cluster. Consequently, In order to assess the effect of agglomerization, it's shown that an optical critical mass is difficult to define because it's relative. An evolutionary development process would then include flexible and evoluting critical mass, which is acquired during a metropolization process. Thanks for